It started with laughter, not the kind that warms a room, the kind that stings. A group of grown men stood around a rusted tractor, pointing at a teenage girl with grease on her hands and fire in her eyes. "You fix this?" one of them sneered. The millionaire farmer crossed his arms, smug. "Tell you what," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "If she can fix this engine, she can keep the whole damn machine." They all chuckled like it was a joke, but she didn't laugh. She wiped her hands, looked him straight in the eye, and said yes. That was the moment everything started to unravel. Reputations, secrets, and a legacy built on silence. Tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Ella Monroe wasn't the kind of girl people noticed. At 17, she'd spent more hours under the hood of an engine than most grown men in her small Missouri town had spent in a library. She didn't care much for makeup or boys or the Friday night football games everyone else lived for. Her life had always been oil-stained hands, heavy tools, and long evenings in the garage with her dad. Tom Monroe was a quiet man, proud in his own way but worn down. Years of doing honest work for dishonest pay had carved lines into his face deeper than any wrinkle. He'd taught Ella everything he knew, and that was a lot. But there was always something unspoken between them. A weight he carried that he never explained. She noticed it most whenever the name Jack Whitmore came up. Jack owned more land than most people in the county combined. If you drove far enough in any direction, you were likely to hit a fence with his name on it. The Whitmore farm was something of a legend. Cornfields stretched out like golden seas, tractors lined up like soldiers, and in the center of it all was Jack. Firm handshake, pressed shirt, eyes like granite. He wasn't cruel. Not exactly. He just didn't think small people mattered much, especially not ones who worked with their hands and didn't know when to keep their heads down. It was the annual harvest fair that set everything in motion. A town tradition full of pie contests, livestock shows, and old farmers trying to outboast each other. Jack brought out his prize tractor, a green 1962 model that hadn't run in over a decade. Rumor was, it was the only machine he couldn't tame. Mechanics had tried, even some from out of state. No one could get it to turn over. It stood there like a monument to frustration, hood up, engine exposed, gathering dust and pitying glances. Ella had walked past it on her way to grab lemonade. She paused. The setup was weird. Something about the alignment of the intake didn't look right. She leaned in closer. Jack caught her staring and wandered over, wearing the kind of smile that says more than words ever could. "Don't tell me you're trying to fix it with your eyes," he said. She shrugged, unbothered. "Just looking. Girl like you wouldn't even know where to start," Jack said, just loud enough for the nearby crowd to tune in. A few people chuckled. Ella didn't move. Tom stepped forward to pull her away, but she didn't budge. Jack raised his voice, eyes glinting with amusement. "Tell you what, you fix it, you can keep it. That's how sure I am it won't happen." More laughter. He turned to the crowd, arms wide like he was on stage. "Who's taking bets?" Ella said nothing, just looked at the engine, then back at him. "Deal," she said. Silence dropped like a stone. Jack's smile faltered just for a second, but he was too proud to back down. He nodded and clapped her on the shoulder. "Well then, let's see what you've got, Monroe." Word spread fast. By the end of the day, half the town had something to say about it. Some thought it was just a stunt. Others figured Jack would find a way to back out. A few, the ones who'd seen Ella work before, just stayed quiet. She didn't talk much about herself, but people who paid attention knew she had a gift, not just for machines, for seeing what others missed. The next morning, she showed up at the Whitmore farm at dawn. Luke Whitmore, Jack's son, was already out by the barn feeding the horses. He was different from his father, same sharp features but softer around the edges. He watched her walk across the gravel without saying a word. "You're serious about this?" he asked finally. She nodded. "Your dad made a deal." Luke scratched the back of his neck. "He did. Just don't expect him to make it easy." Ella didn't answer. She just rolled up her sleeves and got to work. The first few days were quiet. Jack didn't say much, just hovered nearby now and then with his arms crossed. Luke brought her water sometimes, asked questions about what she was doing. She answered when it made sense. She wasn't there to make friends. She was there to prove something, not just to Jack, but to herself, because deep down, she wasn't sure she could do it either. The engine was a mess. Parts were rusted, some missing entirely. But what caught her eye wasn't the damage. It was the inconsistency. Some pieces looked older than the rest, like they didn't belong, like someone had tried to fix it before and failed, or worse, had sabotaged it on purpose. She didn't say anything, not yet. She just kept working, day after day, grease under her nails, sunburn on her neck, fingers raw from gripping cold steel. Tom checked in every evening, sometimes bringing food, always watching from a distance. He looked proud, but worried. She knew why. This wasn't just about the tractor. This was about the past, something he wouldn't talk about, something tied to Jack. On the 5th day, Jack walked over with 2 men Ella didn't recognize. Fancy boots, polished sunglasses, too clean for farm work. Consultants, he said, like that meant anything. They stood over her shoulder, offered uninvited advice, and laughed when she ignored them. Jack didn't stop them, he just watched. That night, Ella sat on the truck bed outside the barn, staring at the sky. Luke joined her, handed her a soda, and sat in silence for a while before speaking. He did the same thing to my uncle, he said finally. Promised him a piece of land if he could harvest a certain yield. When he did, Dad changed the terms, said it was never in writing. Ella didn't say anything, but a small knot in her chest tightened. Luke looked at her. Just be careful. He doesn't like losing, especially not to someone like you. She nodded slowly, eyes still on the stars. Good, she said, because I don't like losing either. And with that, she stood up, wiped her hands on her jeans, and went back into the barn. The sun would rise again in a few hours, and so would she. The second week on the Whitmore farm came in heavier than the first. The sun bore down harder, the air felt thicker, and the weight of expectation, spoken and unspoken, grew like a second skin on Ella's back. People had started driving by just to see her. Some didn't even bother hiding it. They sat in their trucks, chewing sunflower seeds, pointing at the girl in coveralls bent over the engine like it was some kind of circus act. A few called out advice. Others just shook their heads. No one really thought she'd make it run. They just wanted to be there when she failed. Jack, for the most part, kept his distance. He didn't say much, just nodded occasionally if she greeted him, like a man humoring a child with a toy too big for her hands. But Ella noticed everything, how he always seemed to show up when someone important was around, how he offered loud comments about the complexity of the tractor, how he made sure to mention all the experienced mechanics who'd tried and failed before her. It wasn't direct. That wasn't his style. It was quieter, sharper. He was slowly drawing a circle around her and waiting for her to step out of it so he could say, "See, I told you so." Luke, on the other hand, had started coming by more regularly. He didn't interfere, didn't hover, just sat nearby and watched. Sometimes he asked questions, not the kind people ask when they're testing you, but the kind that show they actually want to understand. Ella found herself answering, not because she felt like she owed him anything, but because it felt different, talking to someone who wasn't waiting for her to mess up. One afternoon, as she was cleaning one of the cylinder heads, she glanced up and saw Luke holding an old notebook. He looked uncertain, almost shy as he handed it to her. It was her dad's. His handwriting was all over it. Diagrams, notes, sketches of parts, repair logs from 10 years ago. Luke had found it buried in a shelf in the storage shed behind the barn. Ella took it with a strange feeling in her chest, like someone had just handed her a key she hadn't asked for. She flipped through the pages, her eyes catching dates and names. And then something stopped her. A familiar signature at the bottom of a sketch. Not her father's, Jack's. She stared at the page. The diagram was of a fuel injection system, very similar to the one in the tractor. Her dad had drawn the initial version, but the one below it was slightly altered, annotated in Jack's tidy script. The date on the page was from the same month Tom had been fired from the Whitmore farm. Ella had never known why. Her father had always just said it was time to move on. But now, something wasn't adding up. She didn't bring it up right away. She closed the notebook and tucked it into her backpack. her mind running faster than the gears she spent her days fixing. She needed time, space to think, because deep down, a part of her was starting to believe that her being here wasn't just about a bet anymore. That night, she confronted her father, not with anger, but with quiet insistence. They sat in the garage, the same one where he had taught her how to rebuild her first engine. She placed the notebook on the workbench and opened it to the page. Tom looked at it for a long time before speaking. His voice was calm, but his eyes were tired. He told her the truth. Years ago, he and Jack had worked on a prototype together, a hybrid modification for older engines that could improve efficiency. Tom had the skills, and Jack had the money. They were supposed to share the credit, but when it came time to present it to the Agricultural Board for funding, only one name made it onto the proposal: Jack's. When Tom confronted him, Jack denied everything, said Tom had misunderstood. The next week, Tom was fired, just like that. No explanation, no apology. He never fought back. He had a young daughter, bills to pay, and no proof, so he let it go, or at least he tried to. Ella sat there in silence, staring at the page, the betrayal sinking deeper into her skin. It wasn't just a challenge anymore. It wasn't about fixing an engine. This was personal, and the worst part? Jack knew. He knew exactly who she was and where she came from, and still, he'd set her up like a show pony for the town to laugh at. That wasn't pride. That was cruelty dressed in confidence. Over the next few days, Ella's focus sharpened. Every bolt, every hose, every circuit, she knew exactly what she was doing. And more importantly, why. She wasn't just trying to win a bet now. She was reclaiming something stolen. She worked from dawn until the light faded, barely stopping to eat. Her hands were raw, her eyes burned from squinting at tiny parts in poor light, but she kept going. She'd always had a quiet fire in her, but now it had turned into something else, something harder. Determined. Luke noticed the change. He didn't ask questions, but she could tell he was starting to see the cracks in the story he'd grown up believing. He started pushing back, gently at first, when Jack made dismissive remarks. He asked more questions about the farm's past, about the people who used to work there. Jack didn't like it. He snapped once, told him to mind his place, and Luke didn't respond. But the silence between them stretched wider after that. On the 8th day, Ella discovered something that confirmed everything. A misaligned component tucked deep in the engine's core. It looked intentional, subtle enough to seem like wear and tear, but off just enough to keep the whole thing from running. She carefully removed it, compared it to her dad's notes, and felt the weight of confirmation settle over her. Someone had tampered with the engine, possibly years ago, possibly to make sure no one could ever fix it. She didn't tell anyone. Not yet. She wanted to finish the job first, wanted to hear the engine start with her own ears before she said anything, because once the truth came out, it wouldn't just be about a tractor, it would be about reputation, legacy, and everything Jack Whitmore had built his name on. Word spread that she was close. More people showed up, watching from behind the fence like it was a sideshow. Some were rooting for her, others were just waiting for the moment she slipped. Jack barely acknowledged her anymore. He acted like it wasn't even happening, but Ella could feel it, the tension building like pressure in a sealed tank. Something had to give. Luke offered to help, to be there when she ran the final test. She didn't say no. There was a quiet trust between them now. It wasn't romantic, not yet anyway, but there was something in the way they spoke to each other, like they both knew they were standing on the edge of something bigger than either of them. That night, as the sun dipped below the hills and the wind carried the smell of earth and rust, Ella sat beside the tractor and closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about her father, about how long he'd carried that silence. She thought about Jack and the way power could twist a person into believing they were untouchable. And she thought about all the people who had laughed at her, doubted her, dismissed her without even asking her name. She didn't know how the next day would go. She didn't know what Jack would do when the truth came out, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't backing down, and the engine, for the first time in over a decade, was finally ready. The sky was a soft grey that morning, the kind that makes everything feel heavier than it is, the kind of sky that doesn't promise rain but doesn't offer much light either. Ella arrived at the farm early, as always, her backpack slung over one shoulder, a thermos of coffee in her hand, and her mind sharp. She hadn't slept much. Not because of nerves, but because the final adjustments had taken longer than expected the night before. Every part was in place now. Every valve and belt and sensor checked and double-checked. The tractor, that old beast of a machine, was ready, and so was she. Luke was already there when she walked in. He was leaning against the barn wall with his hands in his pockets and a quiet look on his face, like he knew something big was about to happen, but didn't want to be the one to say it out loud. He just nodded at her, and she nodded back. That was enough. No pep talk. No last-minute doubts. They both understood what this moment meant. By mid-morning, a crowd had started to gather. Not a huge one, but enough to make it clear that word had spread. Neighbors, curious townsfolk, a few old mechanics from around the county who'd heard about the girl trying to fix the impossible engine. Jack wasn't there at first. Ella figured he was waiting. That was his style. Show up at the last second, just in time to take control of the narrative. But she didn't need him there to know what she had done. She stood in front of the tractor, wiped her hands on a rag, and took a deep breath. Then she turned the key. At first there was only silence. Then a groan, a mechanical churn, rough and deep, like the machine was waking up from a long sleep. And then it happened. A sharp cough, a rumble, and finally the steady growl of a running engine. Not perfect, not smooth, but real, alive. People started clapping, more out of shock than anything else. Some just stood there, mouths open, shaking their heads like they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Ella didn't react. She didn't smile or raise her arms or bow. She just stepped back and listened to the sound of her own work, humming like truth in the morning air. That's when Jack arrived. He didn't say a word at first. Just walked through the crowd with that same stiff-backed pride he always carried, stopping right in front of the tractor. He looked at it like it had betrayed him. Then he turned to Ella. "Well," he said, voice low but clear, "I guess I owe you a tractor." Ella didn't move. She reached into her backpack and pulled out the notebook, her father's, the one with the diagrams, the notes, the signature. She flipped it open to the page with the prototype sketch. She didn't raise her voice, didn't look around for support. She just spoke. "My dad designed this," she said. "The same system that's in your tractor. You copied it, and then you fired him." The crowd fell quiet. Jack's eyes flicked down to the page, then back up to her. "That's not how it happened," he muttered, but even he didn't sound convinced. "I found the patent draft," she said, still calm. "Both your names were on it, but you submitted a different one, with just yours." Someone in the back whispered something, then another. The ripple of doubt started to spread, slow but sure. Jack's face tightened. He opened his mouth like he wanted to fight back, but nothing came. Luke stepped forward, not beside his father, but beside Ella. That said more than any words could. "I saw it too," Luke said quietly. "She's telling the truth." Jack stared at his son for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. And then, finally, the pride cracked. He looked back at Ella, and in his silence, something unspoken passed between them. Not regret, not quite, but recognition, like he saw her clearly for the first time. "I made a mistake," he said, barely above a whisper. "I was scared. Your father, he was better than me. I couldn't take that, so I took what wasn't mine. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't even an apology, but it was enough for now." Ella nodded once. "Then make it right." Jack looked around at the crowd, at the faces he'd known for decades. Then he turned to the tractor, still rumbling, and finally let out a breath. "It's hers," he said. "All of it." No one clapped this time. No one cheered. They just stood in silence, watching a man come undone in the face of his own history, and a girl standing taller than anyone expected. Later, after most people had left and the dust had settled, Ella sat on the tailgate of her dad's truck, with the engine still humming in the background. Tom joined her, sat down without saying anything for a while. Then he handed her a soda, just like they used to do after long days in the garage. "I'm proud of you," he said. Ella nodded. "I know." They sat there, in the soft hum of victory that didn't feel like a win. Exactly, but something more honest, something earned. Luke came over after a while. He didn't say much either, just looked at the tractor, then at her. "So what now?" he asked. Ella thought for a moment. "I think I'm going to finish what he started," she said, nodding toward her dad. "But do it my way." Luke smiled. "You're going to change things, you know." Ella smiled too, for the first time in days. "Maybe, but even if I don't, at least they'll hear me now." That was enough. That night, as she drove the tractor home, her tractor, through the quiet streets of the town that once doubted her, people stepped out of their porches to watch. Some waved, some just stared, but no one laughed. She pulled into the driveway, parked it under the old oak tree, and turned off the engine. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything she had fought for. She had fixed the engine. But more than that, she had restored something deeper, not just for herself, but for her father, and maybe even for Luke in his own way. Jack Whitmore had lost something that day. Not just a bet or a tractor, but the version of himself he had built on someone else's silence. And in losing it, maybe he could start becoming someone different. Ella didn't need a parade or a plaque. She had the truth. She had the machine running. And for the first time in her life, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. If this story meant something to you, comment the word repair. Because sometimes fixing what's broken isn't just about tools. It's about courage, memory, and truth. There is a story here on the screen that will also move you. Press to watch. You won't regret it.